Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Caroline Hernandez, and I'm at the Energy Resources Center at the University of Illinois, Chicago. We facilitate the Rights-of-Ways Habitat Working Group, which provides a forum for energy companies and transportation agencies to exchange information and develop best management practices to promote habitat on working landscapes and rights-of-way. We are excited to host this webinar today on telling your pollinator habitat story. This webinar is part of the implementation series where we address pollinator habitat implementation on rights-of-way. If you go to our website, shown here, we have recorded webinars from the implementation series addressing seeding native habitat, how to enhance the habitat you already have, and using the pollinator habitat scorecard. We also post relevant news, best management practices, planning tools, and other resources in addition to general information about the Rights-of-Ways Habitat Working Group, upcoming events, working group tools, and past meeting proceedings. In a few days, there will also be a link to a recording of this webinar along with the recordings of all past webinars. As far as logistics go for today, everyone is on mute except for myself and the presenters. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat box in GoToWebinar and we will respond as best we can. If you have any questions for the presenters related to the content of today's webinar, which we encourage, type those into the chat box as well. We have built some time in the end of the presentation for questions, so please submit them at any time during the webinar. So with that, let's turn to our topic for today. On this webinar, we will be discussing principles and best practices of storytelling, particularly with pollinator habitat in mind. Our first presenter, Josie Davis, will provide a high-level overview of storytelling and communication strategies as well as best practices for reaching your audience. Josie is the owner of Curmudgeon Group, a boutique ad agency in Chicago. As a creative producer and strategist at Curmudgeon, Josie is passionate about helping purpose-led companies to refine their brand story and execute thought-provoking, artful brand campaigns. As a conceptual artist, producer, and director, Josie works in a breadth of media, including live performance, public art, dance, film, and design. Having lived and worked throughout the U.S. and overseas, Josie is a dedicated conservationist serving in the National Council of the World Wildlife Fund, and as a mission-driven agency, Curmudgeon Group serves clients across all agencies who share the philosophy of developing creative solutions through meaningful collaboration, imagination without boundaries, and purpose-driven campaign strategy. Next, Jason Bly from Pheasants Forever will provide some specific examples and recommendations for integrating pollinator habitat into your personal and professional communications. Jason is a professional wildlife biologist with Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever. In 2017, Jason transitioned into a new role within the Habitat organization as a conservation specialist for Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever seed program. In this role, he works with partners and landowners on conservation programs, designing seed mixes, and coordinating wildlife management plans. He also works to pursue and develop new habitat opportunities and new partnership programs. Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever is a nonprofit conservation organization dedicated to the conservation of pheasants, quail, and other wildlife through habitat improvements, public awareness, education, and land management policies and programs. We are excited to jump right in, but before I turn things over to our speakers, we wanted to conduct a quick poll to gauge your current experience and interest. Click your response to the poll, and we will see it live. Okay, I'm going to close the poll in about 10 seconds. Thank you for your input. And with that, I will turn things over to Josie to start us off with some Storytelling 101.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Okay. There we go. Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Josie Davis, and thank you, Caroline, and thank you, Iris, for having me today. I'm really honored to join the webinar. Just a quick background about myself, in addition to what Caroline was introducing. So my name is Josie Davis, and I'm the owner and founder of Curmudgeon Group, and we are a boutique, purpose-driven advertising agency here in Chicago, although we do work with clients from all over the country. We really focus on clients and projects and initiatives that incorporate kind of a social impact kind of mission into their bottom line, and we really see as partners for the long haul. That's really important to us. And some of our areas of expertise include strategy and creative direction and production, along with strategic communications. And our team is really comprised of creative and strategic thinkers and people who are really passionate about telling stories and building campaigns that make a real human impact on people's lives. As Caroline mentioned, I'm both a producer and strategist at the company, as well as an artist. And on a personal level, I grew up surrounded in a very deep way by biologists and conservationists from all over the world, from the EPA in DC to Alaska, the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and the Wilderness Society, World Wildlife Fund, American Rivers in between, and many, many more. And for this reason, conservation continues to play a huge role in the work that I do, both personally and professionally. And I'm always really excited to find ways to integrate my work at my agency with the work in conservation in the field. So we will dive in today to a little bit of a conversation around how to tell your story. From the poll, it kind of indicated that a lot of you aren't super comfortable with that. So we just want to give some high-level tips on how to become more comfortable in that area. And we'll break it into several short chapters, starting really with some key strategic tips about your audience, about your tone of voice, and then best practices for effective storytelling, and then ending up with a few examples of the way that kind of larger brands have done a really good job of incorporating these kind of messages into their communications campaigns when it comes to different kinds of audiences and using and implementing a variety of platforms. And so again, I'm aware that everyone on this call has different degrees of experience when it comes to communications, and your organizations all have very different marketing structures. So, but we do just want to tackle some of the fundamentals that go into storytelling so you can really frame your work effectively down the line. All right. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So the first thing to consider when it comes to telling your story is, who is the audience that you are talking to? Not all stories are going to resonate with all people. And so here are just a few examples of the types of audiences that you might be talking to, both inside and outside of your organization. For example, externally, you might be talking to landowners, residents in the area, scientists, policymakers. And within the organization, you could be trying to talk to executive decision makers, PR and marketing teams, and employees. And all of these different audiences are going to have a different relationship with habitat, with right-of-way, with land management and conservation. So it's really important that you understand the underlying objective and outcome that you're trying to get from people and trying to get them to understand from your work. So once you've honed in on a particular audience for your story, you want to try and understand the following questions, which is really what are the motivating factors for that person or that group of people? Motions are very crucial when you're telling a story. Different motivations often lead to a different story or a different way of framing a story. So for instance, a conservationist might be triggered or might be very angry about the loss of habitat. A landowner could be really frustrated by not having a seat at the table when someone comes in to try and talk to them about right of way. A company executive might be really thrilled with the prospect of increased revenue. And all of these are very different emotional motivations. So understanding those triggers will help you to craft your story in a way that speaks really effectively to that audience. Just a side note here on brand voice. So some of you may never be responsible for writing your own communications, but others here may be doing things as simple as a blog post or a social media tweet. So even when you're dealing with data, with science, it's still really important to write like you speak and to try and stay consistent in how you're framing your research, and to try and be professional without being overly technical. You want to find a way to humanize your research. And all of this helps you to build trust and loyalty with your audience, and will make your work on the ground more human and approachable and accessible, which then leads to increased awareness. And most importantly, it helps to build word of mouth, which is the cheapest, most effective way to get the word out, obviously, about what you're trying to do. And your primary goal here is to build, you want people to immediately grasp the underlying human emotional value of what you are doing. So just a quick kind of summary here. It's really important to understand your value and your target market, and then you build a story around that. So every brand has a value proposition, but value is just as applicable to your field work and your work on the ground when it comes to habitat pollinators and right-of-way. So think about the core values behind your work and what you stand for and those things that separate you from the pack. A good question to ask yourself is, why should people care? Why should anyone care about the work you're doing in habitat pollinators and right-of-way? You want to combine the answer to this unique value with your audience that you've focused on, and then start to build your story around those things. So basically, your communication strategy should accomplish the following things. It should represent your core values. It should be distinct, simple, human, purposeful, and relatable. And it should always reflect the personality of your brand and your audience. So a big thing to think about when you think about storytelling is where and how you want to reach people. There are a lot of platforms you can use when it comes to marketing communications, but here is a list of some of the best channels for reaching your audiences through storytelling specifically. Some of these are more visual, like print and film and grassroots campaigns, and others are more informative and educational, like white papers and press releases and blogs. It's really best to try and combine information and visuals to try and draw people into what you're doing with visuals that are more emotional and evocative, and then feed them information in that process. And you want to try and diversify and play with where your stories appear, because again, not all people look for information in the same places. But at the same time, you want to be consistent in the story that you're telling to a particular audience. So even though location may vary, the story to that audience should always be the same and feel the same way. There we go. Okay, so just a quick quote. People like to see, read, or hear stories because they create a human connection that builds empathy. Just as something to remind yourself to think about in the future as to why stories are important. Okay, so let's dive in here to the nuts and bolts of storytelling. So first off, we want to understand what it is. Storytelling, when applied to your organization, to any kind of project or brand, really is a cohesive narrative that weaves together facts and emotions. It's both what you communicate as much as how your audience perceives that communication. Your messaging is all of the communications that over time begin to build a relationship that tells people why you matter and why they should care. And a story can be used both, again, internally and outside of your organization or a certain department, but they should always be contagious, emotional, simple, easy to understand, believable, useful, inspiring, and inclusive. And this right here is a really good checklist to come back to when you are thinking about how to tell your story or how to effectively communicate the work you are doing on the ground. So think about for a second, why is storytelling important? Storytelling is important because it builds a deeper, stronger connection with your audience. It adds a human, relatable element to any kind of content, whether that be a press release, a social post, or even a film. It builds trust and credibility with your audience, especially the public and stakeholders. It increases engagement in an already oversaturated, fragmented market. And this is super key because, as we all know, we're surrounded by information and content. It's everywhere we look. And so having an emotional story is a really great way to draw people in and to get them to focus in on what you are trying to talk to them about and what you are doing on a day-to-day, apart from everything else that is stimulating them. And finally, it's really the most successful tool out there for building awareness and word of mouth. Okay, so just a quick fact here. So it's really important to understand that people remember stories 22 times more than data alone. I know a lot of us here are scientists or are data-driven, and in no way am I devaluating the importance of data, but I want you to think about how you can augment or reframe your key data points in a more emotional, authentic, and human way. Is there a way to tell people about the work you're doing on the ground and draw them in through the lens of someone who may be experiencing the work you're doing or being impacted by it? And then through that process, you can feed them more of the data that is kind of the foundation of that emotional story. Okay, so there are 3 real goals that are universal for any story, any effort in storytelling, and you want to refer back to these as you start crafting your habitat and right-of-way stories. First of all, it's information. What do you want to share about your work with your audience? What is so important about right-of-way, about habitat pollinators that you want? What's the key takeaway? What's the one thing that you want people to remember when they see your story or hear your name? The second is values. What do you stand for? What values do you want to evoke in the mind of your audience? And finally, trust. Always have consistency in the back of your mind. This is really going to help build credibility, especially when people who may not be immediately bought into what you're doing. So not everyone is going to be sold off the bat in terms of the value of right-of-way or the value of saving habitat. So think about, the more that you can emphasize and be consistent in your story, the more you'll be seen as credible, and the more people will start to want to trust you. So again, just another quote here. There's no better way to keep people engaged than by telling them a story. Again, just emphasizing the emotional element of things. So I want to go a little deeper and talk about what really makes for an effective story, the key elements. First of all, point of view. Every story has a protagonist. Just think back to any book you read. You want to think about who is telling your story. That person or character should always reflect in some way the audience that you are trying to reach. For instance, is your story being told by a landowner or a rancher or an employee at the company or someone on your team or a member of the public who really cares about or is affected by habitat loss? Each of these protagonists, you want to let them be as human as possible. Stories are not meant to be data-driven and technical. Second, you want to think about, the one thing that you want people to remember about your work. Most importantly, if your story does not matter if you cannot get people to care. So you want to keep it human. You want to transport people, simplify information, and provoke an emotional response. People will always catch on quickly when things are not what they seem. In other words, if they're not authentic, people don't buy in. And you can think about this by just thinking of any brand and what motivates you to buy them. Most of us, if we don't trust a brand, we see that there's a lot of lies or falsehoods, we're not going to invest in that person or that brand. Okay. So next, you want to make it quick. People have an average attention span of 8 seconds, which is really small. So it's critical that you keep things concise. It's easy to want to share all of your amazing, hard-earned research information with everyone all the time, but it's more important to focus on the key highlights. You want to present your facts quickly and pull at the heartstrings for maximum impact. You always want to go back to those underlying motivational emotions that we talked about earlier. And finally, you want to be flexible. And what I mean here is that not all stories need to look the same or reach people in the same place. Some stories ask for a lot of editing and re-editing and polishing and approval by various departments and teams before they go public. This could include like a film or a press release. But other stories succeed because they're more raw and authentic and come just from you and are not edited, such as social media content or behind-the-scenes photos. And this is what gives people a glance at what really is happening on the ground. And so it's really smart to try and, toy with these different ways of telling stories and see what works for you, see what kind of stories need to be framed in what way. And there's really no right answer to that. It just takes kind of a little bit of experimentation. So just to recap this section about what makes an effective story, you want to have a point of view, you want to have a clear, consistent tone of voice, you want to get emotional and be authentic, you want to share your expertise but not be overly technical, and you want to use concise language and be flexible in terms of how you're telling your story. Just one last quote here. Storytelling is as much about the telling as it is about the story. And I really like this quote because it emphasizes how important the way the story is told is to the effectiveness of the story in the end. And we'll talk about that a little in a moment. So before we dive into a few case studies, I just want to touch quickly on what makes for a broader communications or PR campaign successful. And again, I know a lot of you are not in a position to be crafting a large campaign, but it is important as you think about a story that eventually is going to feed into a larger campaign. So you want to think about these key elements in the beginning. So as you can see here, there's a lot of overlap with basic storytelling strategies. We want to align with values that go above and beyond the initial or the intended service. So again, knowing your core values. We want to resonate as authentic and personally meaningful. We want the campaign or the story to be memorable and lasting, always targeted to a particular audience. We want a novelty factor, meaning it should be unique, whether there's a unique story being told, a unique protagonist, eye-catching creative, or anything that really makes that story and that campaign stand out from everything around it. And we always want to communicate a clear benefit. You want to understand, what's the benefit that people are going to get when they invest in you. So the hope here is that your habitat work and your right-of-way work is going to expand and grow and build awareness over time. But as that happens, you need to continually vary your approach to messaging because the needs and motivations of your audience are always going to evolve, and you want to evolve with them. And the best way to do this is to tell your story through visuals and the use of characters that reflect and resonate with the audience you're going after. So for instance, you can see here we have two very different images that tell two very different stories. They're used in campaigns that are targeting two very different audiences. On the right, we have an insurance company that's targeting, like what I can tell, are probably ranchers and farmers, the landowners, likely middle to lower income, have probably strong family connections, Rust Belt era possibly. On the left, we have city-dwelling millennials and LGBTQ advocates, human rights people. So it gives an immediate sensation of who you want to reach. And that's really important in storytelling. Okay, so again, just a quick recap of all the benefits we've talked about and the kind of what makes for an effective story that we talked about so far. So know your audience. Are you speaking to them directly in an emotional way? Emphasize the benefits. What can people expect when they invest in you? Placement. What are the best platforms you can use? You want to meet people where they are. You don't want to make it too hard for people to find you. You want clear goals. Before you even begin with a campaign or a storytelling strategy, you need to know what success looks like and what the problem is that you're trying to solve. You want to be consistent with those goals. You want to diversify where people are seeing your message and your story. You want to get creative and try new things, and you want to test and track. So not everything is always going to work the way you think it will. So it's important to you, whether you do it with your own team or you collaborate with other people in your company. You want to gauge how people are reacting so you can continually improve your story and your message. So now I just want to look at a couple quick case studies and we'll wrap it up. These are two examples of brands that did a really great job of telling a story and incorporating that story into a campaign with great success. So there are a lot of campaigns and companies out there that don't really emphasize storytelling, and these are just two of the best that are out there. We don't have time to touch on a lot of others, but you can always reach out to me and I can talk to you more about kind of tips and strategies. And I really encourage you to kind of just dive in. You can always look up brand storytelling, and there's a lot of information out there, a lot of articles if you want to on your own time. So Philips. Philips is a global technology company focused on improving people's lives. That's their core underlying mission. You probably know them through some of their, hardware, light bulbs, things like that. This is one of the best and most well-regarded examples of the use of storytelling in the world today. They were trying to build awareness around their efforts around sleep apnea and chronic fatigue. And the way they did this was using an authentic, real-life story with a real person, an Icelandic fisherman who is dealing with sleep apnea and chronic fatigue. And they used this film to tell his story. It's told from his point of view and is highly emotional and does not mention Philips or any of their research until the final moments. So it really emphasizes emotion, and it draws people into a human, relatable, real-life story, presenting Philips as a solution and as a company that cares about people and not just about data or profits. And that's what really sold people on this campaign. And then along with the film and the creative side of things, Philips released a suite of information and solutions on their website and digital about sleep apnea, which was a great way to tell a story that then led people to the information they needed and raised awareness of the company's mission and their goals. So it really had all the right elements. But what made it successful was the use of that personalized story and that authentic human real life protagonist. And just, while it isn't a different, while the Philips was in a different industry, it's just thinking about how to use a real life narrator and juxtaposing that person's struggle with the solutions and benefits that only you and your team can offer. So here we have National Geographic. They did a really successful campaign around, it's called the Missing Big Cat campaign, about the rising decline of big cats in the wild. Their National Geographic in general is really great at telling stories by combining facts and visuals. Before I dive into this, I just want to mention their social media campaigns. It's really worth taking a moment to look up National Geographic on your Instagram feed or Facebook, but Instagram is probably the best. They use social media in a really strong way because they pull you in through a really, kind of awe-inspiring visual of wildlife and nature, but they combine that with a sidebar story that's very educational and informative and contextual. And, but they use the visual to stop someone in their tracks. And this is kind of a similar approach, but in a different medium. So you have this commissioned big art, this big poster in the style of a standard missing cat poster, with facts on it about the rising decline of cats in the wild. So, and as people walk across it over time, they actually subconsciously erase the picture of the cat. So it really is an evocative, smart way of putting habitat and wildlife loss in front of people while having them interact with it directly, although unknowingly, and resulting in a ton of global press and was highly shareable and photographic. And similar to Philips, the piece was connected to online digital elements and combined, both emotional and data points. People could go online and learn a lot more about the issue. They kind of checked all the boxes. They told a story that had a very clear problem, the decline in cats. They had a very clear audience, which were people who were kind of unaware of the issue. Facts, which were presented on the poster as well as online. They knew they were able to show people what Nat Geo was doing about the issue, and they made people feel a certain way. People were not able to avoid the problem, they couldn't turn away from the issue, and so the story was framed in a very strong way where it was just kind of front and center, unavoidable, with an issue that many people just want to turn away from in general. So they kind of use that to their advantage. So the takeaway here is that by telling your story in a more unpredictable format, the result often leads to more awareness, to more word of mouth and press than just going through traditional methods or only using traditional methods alone. So then we've covered a lot. So before I hand it off to Jason, just want a quick recap here of all kind of the best practices that are good to consider. You want to know your audience. You want to meet people where they are. Be clear and consistent in your tone of voice. Be authentic and evocative. Keep it simple. Diversify and be flexible. Get creative. Reflect your values, and then leverage partners. And I know Jason will talk more about partnerships. I didn't tackle that quite as much, but partnerships are really key and can really help to build awareness more than you could ever do alone. So that's it. Here's my information. Please connect with me, connect with my agency if you have any questions. I'd love to hear from you, and I will pass it on to Jason, and he can take it from here and dive a little more into how this all applies to conservation and habitat work.
All right, I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me all right, Josie?
We can hear you, Jason.
Okay, perfect. All right, so just to start off here, like Caroline said, I'm a wildlife biologist with Pheasants Forever. For 5 years, I was basically covering East Central Illinois and then the north half of Illinois, and over time transitioned into a new role within the organization with our national seed program, where our main goal is to put high quality habitat on the ground and develop seed mixes that meet all of the pollinator and wildlife needs out there, while also pursuing new partnerships and methods and new ways to get habitat on the ground. This Rights of Way group has been a fantastic app for finding new partnerships and new partners and new audiences to get habitat on the ground. We've already done a lot of good work with a lot of the partners involved in this. So like Caroline mentioned, just a quick background on Pheasants Forever. We're a nonprofit conservation organization dedicated to the conservation of pheasants, quail, and all other wildlife through habitat improvements, public awareness, education, and land management policies. And in short, our goal is to put habitat on the ground. That's our main mission, get habitat on the ground. So before I get started, I just wanted to say thanks for attending, and thanks, Josie, for the presentation. It's a perfect lead into some of my slides, which are basically a bunch of short, simple examples of how to tell your story, how to tell our story at Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever, and how to stay relevant in a modern world. So the first thing that I would like to talk about, a couple years ago, we did a big youth pollinator project in my hometown, involving a lot of the local groups and the school district. And I just want to show a quick video of that to get this going. And sorry if that came in a little unclear or spotty, but the goal of that video was to show just a short, simple, and to the point example of a bigger goal. That video and that project that we did with the school district gained a lot of media attention locally. We had a lot of community involvement. Our local Pheasants Forever chapters, local businesses, the newspaper, the local news all came to do stories on it. Just shows that if you keep it simple and get kids involved, talking about the next generation, you can have a huge impact in a local area. Not to mention that project is saving the school district $2,000 a year in mowing, contracting, and maintenance fees. So just a cool little video to kind of get this started. Moving on to the next slide. So like Josie talked about, something that we always try to put into our presentations is adding our personal stories, or putting some sentimental value or some emotion into it. And I always like to start my presentations with talking about my personal story of what got me interested in conservation and wildlife habitat. As you can see, this is my family farm in Ford County, Illinois. And I like to talk about back in the 50s, it was a corn bean operation. My grandpa, he started farming 30s and 40s with horses, and changed over to that John Deere tractor in the picture in the late 40s. The cool thing about that photo there, that's our first conservation project that we did on our farm almost 25 years ago now. And then fast forwarding to the last couple of years, the bottom two pictures are a couple examples of where we're at now on our farm and our story with wetland restorations, tree plantings, and tons of pollinator habitat. So I just like to tell that story. It's my personal experience and my story of what got me involved in conservation. And it really resonates with people because a lot of people have that very similar story with the family farm. Another thing that we like to talk about is just showing simple results. And this is very cliche, but we say it all the time. If you build it, they will come. And whether you're trying to get more pollinators on your property or support the monarch population, or if you're a hunter or outdoorsman and you want to see more pheasants, one thing that we're always talking about is the same habitat that's great for monarch butterflies and for pollinators is also great for pheasants and quail and all the other wildlife species out there. So I like to integrate those two together pretty often. And again, just another thing, visuals, they're so important. And even though it's a simple thing, it's easily forgotten. We just like to show a lot of pictures of the projects that we do, what they look like on the landscape, and what landowners and groups can expect with the project down the road. So why does pollinator habitat really matter to us? That's what the point we're trying to get across to tons of different audiences, whether it's farmers, landowners, corporations, urban groups, kids. There's so many different audiences that we're trying to connect with from Pheasants Forever, and I'm sure it's the same for your groups. And the way that we do that is by keeping it simple and making it something that everybody can understand. Food. Everybody needs it. It's the easiest thing to talk about, whether you're talking to a class of 10-year-olds or a group of urban people. Everybody needs food, and it's just something simple. $200 billion industry, and without pollinators, we don't have a lot of the produce that's in grocery stores. So it's just something simple to get the point across to people. And another thing that is really important, and obviously, especially with this group, talking about the economics of these projects. For instance, this one talks about the annual value of honeybee pollination to U.S. agriculture. It's a $15 to $19 billion per year industry. That's huge for the national economy, and especially in local areas. But again, with the rights-of-way groups, these projects are also saving money and helping with maintenance costs for transmission companies, power plants, pipelines. So it's something that we like to incorporate into our story and how we're helping groups to save money or to even make money in certain situations. And again, to bring the story closer to home, I like to show this. It's colony collapse disorder. Obviously, a lot of you guys have heard about this, but bringing that closer, I work with a lot of local landowners, and although this isn't colony collapse disorder, this is a story from just 20 miles from my hometown where one of the local beekeepers, who's also a farmer and landowner, had all his bees get killed by spray drift. And it's just one of those local stories that Josie was telling us about earlier that's so important to get the message across that happening on the other side of the country. This is happening right in our backyards. And so again, just from the Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever standpoint, we like to talk about how pollinator habitat is really vital for wildlife. Hunters, fishermen, outdoorsmen are a big part of our audience, and we like to keep that as one of the targets. And this is a research project that we worked on with the University of Illinois over the last 3 or 4 years. And although it was a super in-depth, 3-year project with tons of funding and tons of monitoring and technical side to it, this slide kept it really simple when I'm talking to landowners, when I'm talking to groups. As you can see on the left, that's all the different habitat types on a big block of DNR managed ground. And the light green is pollinator habitat. On the right side, all those the little green dots are pheasants, radio-collared birds, and it shows where they like to hang out throughout the year. And all of the green spots are in those pollinator fields. So it's just a really easy visual to show people, pollinator habitat matters for wildlife, and here's the proof. Another thing that I like to show and that we try to tell when we're working with groups to do these projects is what to expect. And, 1 year after a seeding, 2 year after a seeding, 10 years, this is telling the story and showing, people what to expect out there. It helps them to tell their story better. In the first year, a lot of these projects are weedy and kind of ugly looking, and people need to be able to educate others on that. Not set expectations too high right off the beginning. But you can see by year 10 with the fire management here, you've got a great looking project. And again, keeping it simple with all the graphs that are out there. These are some really important graphs that Monarch Watch has put out regarding the monarch population, and I like to use that leading into the importance and significance of the West and different areas on the landscape where we're really trying to target doing these projects. And one slide that I feel like we don't talk about enough, or we don't tell this story, is December of 2020 is one of the biggest decisions that the Fish and Wildlife Service, may ever have to make or has made in a long time. And that's the decision of whether or not to put the monarch butterfly on the endangered species list. And why should this matter to people? It could be huge, whether you're in development, whether you're in agriculture, or whether you're in conservation. It could have tons of different, consequences or effects, whether it does or doesn't get listed. So we're trying to tell the story of over the next year here, we need to get as much habitat on the ground and get as many groups involved with this as possible to keep it from getting listed. And so one more thing that I like to show is, even though that's a little bit scary talking about the monarch and how it could be listed in 1 year, I like to show easy, simple examples of the work that we're doing is paying off. And here's a video from just down the road from my family farm, another landowner that we're working with. Just a simple 10-second video of all the monarchs passing through in September last year. And we had hundreds of thousands of them using our conservation fields, our pollinator habitat fields. And it's just showing that the work that we're doing is paying off. It's attainable, it's within reach. And even though, these decisions have a lot of magnitude, we're finding ways to get the job done, and we're moving in the right direction. So another thing that Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever, like I mentioned in that video before, one thing that we really like to work with is community groups, and especially youth groups. We love getting kids out there. Without the next generation, you know, all the work that we're doing will be worthless if we don't get the next generation involved and keep this conservation going. So a lot of times we'll get kids out there, we'll educate them on the importance of these projects, we'll get them out there throwing seed. And the cool thing about kids is, you know, they have fun getting their hands dirty, and some of these projects that we're doing with them turn out just as good, if not better, than when we're using a $35,000 or $30,000 piece of equipment to do a project. So it just shows that it doesn't take rocket science to get these projects done. It's so easy that a 10-year-old kid can knock it out. And we've got some great examples of these projects that kids have done. Again, just the importance of involving kids and local communities. This is a big educational day that we did with Ameren Transmission in Illinois. We had 4 or 5 different schools come through that day within the county, talk to them about the importance of conservation, about the importance of sustainable energy. We got some great pictures, great media attention, and overall just a great day to tell our story of what we're doing. And so that's all good and well, but in this modern landscape, you know, things are always changing. Here in the Midwest, we have some of the best farm ground in the country. We have a lot of development happening, but how do we get these projects on the ground, and what are some of the results? Again, this is a map of Illinois. This is all the Conservation Reserve Program projects that we've done in the last 5 years for the CP42 Pollinator Habitat Program. And as you can see, you know, even in Illinois, we have some of the best farm ground in the country, and we're getting these projects done entirely across the state in every county. And again, bringing that closer to home, a lot of people want to, you know, they might get somewhat excited about that statewide map, but when you show them what it looks like in their backyard in their county, here's the we have going on in East Central Illinois where I'm at. And showing maps and showing these simple visuals is huge for getting people involved and showing them the work that we're doing. And again, just simple visuals are so important. We like to show off some of these hard to farm areas, and it's the same with energy groups. They have areas, you know, might be easier to put it into pollinator habitat and let it be, and we've got visuals of that as well. But just showing off some of these areas where we can do these habitat projects is really important. And again, talking about the patience of this, these projects are very different than going out and throwing turf grass on the ground or throwing fescue out there and it turning green within weeks. Some of these projects take a little bit longer, but we have ways to, you know, to basically guarantee that it's going to be successful. And again, I like to show just a lot of the visuals of the projects that we've done. One thing that we've done with some of our partners is make sure to show before and after photos. That really shows people the difference in the work that we're doing. Here's a project, a great partnership between IDOT and Ameren Transmission here in Illinois. You can see the before and after photos, and people love seeing the changes on the landscape. And again, just some of the pollinator projects that we've done that we like to show off. And one thing that we're really starting to get into as organization is telling our story more physically or on the ground. We're trying to do more field tours, getting new audiences, getting our farmers, landowners, our partners out there on projects, showing them the importance of that we're doing and show them, you know, in person that it's paying off. And here's one, another example. This is so simple, but it's often forgotten. The easiest part of a project is at the end of it, when everything's done, and slapping the sign in the ground, showing off the work that you do. It's one of the easiest ways to tell the story. But again, it's often forgotten because we move on to the next project. And here's just a couple more pictures of some of the signage that we've done on projects, some of the partnerships with the DOTs. And again, I just want to reemphasize the importance of partnerships that help. The more partners that you can get involved, the more people are telling that story. Again, here's the partnership with Ameren Transmission. We had the media out there, talked about it in the news and in the newspaper. Just a great way to spread the word. And this is a really special moment in time for conservation. Some of the numbers that we like to promote when we're telling our story is over the last 5 years, we've done over 12,000 pollinator projects, 155,000 acres. And my favorite statistic is we have put close to 700 million milkweed seeds on the ground now. And those they just resonate with people, and they put numbers to those maps that I showed earlier. And I like showing this slide too, especially when talking about kids projects and the simplicity of what we're dealing with. It's simple until we make it complicated. I feel like sometimes when there's a lot of partners involved, you get a lot of opinions and a lot of paperwork and a lot of pushback, or what could be pushback. And these projects are simple, they're easy, they're fun to do, and we're more than happy to help you get them on the ground. And that's it for my part of the presentation. Caroline, if you want to take it back over.
Thanks, Jason, and thank you, Josie. So I am going to pause for a moment, and if you have any questions for the presenters, just type them into that chat box, and we can answer them. And while we're waiting for questions, since we have a few minutes, Josie, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but using Jason's example of that picture of the kids spreading seeds in those giant oversized shirts, that was really cute. Could you give us an example of like a good way to tell that story of putting habitat on that right of way, just based on that picture?
Well, maybe Jason can recap. I mean, I think what's the goal that we want with that? So I think that it would go back to those questions of the audience that you want out of that. So if you're trying to talk to who you're trying to reach in terms of I think if you're trying to reach people who are trying to Jason, recap it a little bit what the goal of that particular project was.
Yeah, so a lot of times on our youth pollinator projects, we're just trying to get multiple partners involved and basically educate kids on the importance of pollinator habitat, why it should matter to them, and how to do these projects. And so in that example, we had a bunch of kids out there throwing seed on the ground and getting their hands dirty and basically helping us get a project on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jason is telling the story pretty well already. There's not a lot I would change with that. I mean, I think you have. I think a good way to maybe tell it would be to have it being told from the point of view of one of the kids. Would be a really strong way to tell that story, because you have again, the person who's really seeing the most change and you're really trying to get on the ground are the children. So if you have that project being told in some way through even like a really low res video, could be, or having them run their own social media channel or whatever it is that kind of, and you can even brainstorm with children. They're really fun to work with in that way, and saying, how would you want to tell the story? Like, how do you want to You know, how do you feel like the story needs to be told? And you kind of, instead of trying to tell it the way you think they want to tell it, get their input. And I mean, I think that's one of the most important takeaways, is thinking about, you know, you have these stakeholders, and one of the biggest stakeholders in that story is the children, are the youth and the teens, and trying to get them more involved. And you want to tell the story from their perspective. So that would be my one piece of advice, is to go and really find a way that resonates with them in terms of, and ask them, say, what's the real benefit to you for this, and why are you here? And then kind of use that information to tell a story, or have them create their own, go out with a camera and film each other, or do whatever it would be to kind of create that story that is really evocative from their perspective.
Thank you, Josie. I do have another question for you from Michelle. Sure. She says, what is the most effective way to reach out and get the community involved if you're not working with kids?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, it really depends on what you are, what your project is and what your goal of the project is. You know, I think maybe I'll ask Michelle a question, is like, are you thinking about a project where the community is already kind of interested in what you're doing, but not quite motivated to get involved, and you're just trying to motivate them to get involved? Is that the hiccup, or is it an issue with trying to convince people of the value of what you're doing?
She said, yes, with Pollinator projects. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, so Michelle, I think if people really understand, if people aren't quite sold on why there's value in terms of what you're doing, then I think it's really good for you to try and, I mean, then it's an issue of trying to trying to get them at the table, and kind of, again, that goes back to that issue of building trust with them and telling your story over and over and over again in through different channels. And I think just trying to think about all the different ways where you want to try and meet people where they are. That's that statement again of knowing where, you know, think about, okay, where have you been trying to tell your story? Are you trying to reach people and motivate people through a certain outlet right now, and that maybe you're just not getting, maybe people are just not, you're not hitting the right audience, right? So maybe you just need to experiment and try. I know it's not the most sexy answer, but you do want to try and find a different way, different avenue for targeting people. And I would also just think about partnerships. You know, what are other groups out there and you already have access to the audience you're trying to go after, and how can you work with them to get them to maybe have events or experiences, or, you know, moments where you're working with Habitat and you can come together and feed off of an audience that's already active in the community.
Thank you, Josie. And I think to be respectful of everybody's time, I'm going to end the webinar, but I want to end it with a huge thanks to both presenters for working with me to develop the content of the webinar, and as well as presenting and sharing their expertise with a broader audience. I also want to thank all attendees. If we did not get a chance to answer your questions, we will work to follow up with you afterwards with answers. And then feel free to reach out to both presenters with questions if they come to you later on. And then finally, I will email the webinar registrants once the recording of the webinar has been posted to our website in the next week or so. So thank you all again, and I hope you have a good rest of your week.